Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I'm making probably the most personal video I have made on this channel to this point, and that is how I discovered my passion for writing. I'm preparing to self-publish a book this summer, and I thought now is a good time as ever to document my journey up to this point. If you're also a writer, regardless of how much you've written or if you're published or not, I encourage you to share your story in the comments below and to, keep fueling the authortube community. And that I basically started writing very early in my life. I watched a lot of 80s action movies at probably too young of an age that I was supposed to. I was probably like 8 or something when I started watching like Terminator and Predator and things like that. And that's kind of the first earliest spark of when I started to write. My writings are basically just ripoffs of Predator and Alien and Terminator, except I would call Terminator Decimator, Predator, Hunter, and et cetera, et cetera. Transformers were Transmorphers or something like that. Just complete ripoffs of things. But I was writing a lot, and I was not so much writing the stories, but like writing characters and plot ideas and things like that. And then I would share them with my dad, and he'd be like, "Wow, this is just a ripoff of a movie you just watched last weekend." But he wouldn't say that to my face because I was very young at the time. And it was a huge passion of mine. I liked to draw a lot too back then. And so I would draw characters and draw aliens and stuff and create backstories for them. And then I would start to write stories on my own, but I was 8, 9, 10, and the interest would quickly go somewhere else because that's how typically people that young operate. And I definitely fell out of it after that. Like probably once I got into middle school, completely lost interest in writing. Because I had friends and I liked sports at the time, and so my interests changed, and that's pretty normal for people, for kids going from elementary school to middle school, and I completely fell out of it. I still liked movies and I liked to read on the occasion, but again, no real writing done at the time. But then my real first passion for writing came probably in early high school, a passion that is carried forth into who I am now. And that came in early high school, and is when I started watching the show Game of Thrones and started reading the book Song of Ice and Fire. I was a relatively decent fantasy fan at the time. I loved Lord of the Rings, of course, and as I said, I loved those 80s and 90s sci-fi action movies. But I wouldn't say I was a huge fantasy fan, period. And I'm still not to this day. I only really like A Song of Ice and Fire and Lord of the Rings to this day still. But for example, my friends really loved Harry Potter and Percy Jackson and the Olympians or whatever, and it never really struck to me as anything interesting because Lord of the Rings had a darker tone to it, which I appreciated, but that was very much lacking in Harry Potter and Percy Jackson. It was fairly generic good guys versus fairly generic bad guys. It never really captivated my interest. But then A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, exploded in the popular zeitgeist, and I was on the bandwagon. I was a little earlier than the big popularity moments of it. I started watching Game of Thrones season 1. I mean, again, it was still pretty popular, but not super popular, as it eventually came in season 5 and on. But I was just completely floored by it, and I was obsessed with the books as well. But no real writing happened at the time. I was just completely obsessed with the show and basically everything about the Song of Ice and Fire world. But then that interest kind of changed for me during the Battle of the Blackwater episode of Game of Thrones, season 2, episode 9. It's spoilers if you don't know. I mean, you're not watching this video if you care, but it's the Battle of Blackwater episode outside King's Landing in season 2, when it's Tyrion and the Lannisters against Stannis and the Baratheons forces, and that was a huge change in how I viewed characters in writing, because up to that point, you basically hated the Lannisters other than Tyrion. You hated Cersei because she was partially responsible for killing Ned Stark. You hated Joffrey because he was responsible for killing Ned Stark. And you liked Tyrion because he was sort of the black sheep of the family. But watching this episode and seeing how I actually sympathized with the Lannisters, because ultimately they're just as afraid to die as anyone else. And it just struck a chord with me where it's wow, characters can actually be this dynamic. You can see their perspective better. They're not just villains. They are people who have alternate motivations than the main characters you are following, that being the Starks. And that would just click for me, and that's kind of when the passion for writing came back, at least as it is now. And I started becoming obsessed with character work specifically, and creating characters that might seem flawed from one perspective, but change when you get an entirely different perspective. And that stemmed my first attempted book, which I have right here. I think I wrote this in like sophomore, junior year of high school. I have not looked at this for like almost 10 years at this point, but suffice it to say, it is basically in A Song of Ice and Fire ripoff, and I'm horrified of reading it, but I think I might read it for a video, my first dry reaction of it, years, almost a decade later. But yeah, I think I'm very much just opening this up again, but it was my first attempted novel. It did not last very long. I think I pretty much filled this journal with the novel, but I eventually gave up on it because I realized it was just a ripoff of A Song of Ice and Fire. And again, I'll maybe read that. You might do like a reaction video to it someday. But that was my first ever attempt at it. And then probably late high school when Star Wars The Force Awakens was like the only thing that nerds like me could talk about. And I was totally on board the Star Wars hype train at the time. But sort of at the time, I kind of combined my interest with A Song of Ice and Fire with my sort of interest in sci-fi. And I started writing the book that I'm going to publish hopefully this summer. And it was not a very it's not a very easy starting point because this book specifically is one that I have started and put down countless times, putting it down thinking I was done permanently. But I started it for the very first time, like my senior year of high school. And then, college happened. And when you're preparing for college, you sort of drop it a little bit. But I had a very, rough freshman year of college. And so I didn't have a lot of friends. And I spent a lot of the time in the library because I didn't want to be with my roommate. And during that time period, I did a ton of writing for this book. Probably about a third of what my original scope of it was. Probably about a third of that book was written then. And then I transferred out of that school into a different school, and the book kind of got dropped off again. But I was very obsessed with, I wrote 6 chapters during that freshman year, and then my sophomore year, I was obsessed with editing those chapters to make them perfect without, actually moving on to finishing the story. And then one time I was in I don't know if you'll remember the story, but I was with my friend Tyler, who as Carlos Wonderland. I was in his dorm with him. We were just doing homework, and I was telling him about this conundrum. I'm just obsessed with writing these chapters over and over again to make them perfect. And he's like, why don't you just finish writing the story and then go back after once you understand the full scope of it? I was like, oh my god, you can actually go after the first 7 chapters and keep writing the story. And then after that, I sort of buckled down a little bit more and kept writing more often, not going back to the same chapters and editing them and expecting them to be perfect, but just trying to finish the story and getting a better idea of how the story will progress after it's done. And just to clarify, I wrote those first chapters about 5 years ago, and I'm doing one last hard edit right now, and I'm still making huge changes to those chapters. So even 5 years later, there are things that I still need to change, but again, it has to be published at some point. And then sophomore year was basically when I got the majority of the rough draft of the book finished, and I was pretty happy with it. Even though I would delve back and forth between different ideas, I would put it down, start writing something else, and then pick it back up again, put it down, start writing something else, give up on it. But that was the one book that I kept going back to for whatever reason. I never fully gave up on it, whereas I've given up on a ton of other novels during my late high school, early college career. And then my junior year of college, I started having a better social life, and with that, I stopped writing a lot. It's interesting. Looking back on my history with writing, it's definitely when I'm my most isolated, I do a lot of writing. But when I'm having fun and I'm having an engaging social life, I don't do a lot. But then also my writing is inspired by what I do when I'm having an engaging social life. For example, I went to Trinity College in Oxford during my summer between sophomore and junior year, and I didn't do a lot of writing then because I had schoolwork and partying to do. But a lot of my experiences from that time have made their way into my writing. So it's interesting. It's a weird dichotomy of okay, so I'm having a good time not doing a lot of writing, but then when I'm doing a lot of writing, I'm taking those experiences from when I didn't do a lot of writing because that's what writers do. They just take their experiences and put them they take forms of their experience, variations of their experiences, and they put them into their own writing. And so interesting dichotomy there, but again, sort of had given up on the book because I just got frustrated with it around my junior year. And then senior year, I did my semester abroad at University College Dublin. And again, I had a very active social life at the time. So therefore, I was not doing a lot of writing. And that's basically kind of when I was done with my book that I started my senior year of high school. I was done with it, and I kind of just moved on. And I wasn't really doing a lot of writing in general at the time period. And then I came back for my last semester, my senior year, in the spring of 2020, and we all know what happens there. COVID hits, and all of a sudden it's March, and we're all in isolation. We're all in lockdown for the foreseeable future, and that was when I picked up my book again after probably a good 8 months of just not really thinking about it. And I was like, because I wrote everything in journals. I didn't type anything up for the most part. So I took my journals, which I had like 5 of them filled with this stupid thing, and was just basically transcribing them into document Microsoft Word form. And that was basically what I did for the first couple months of COVID. And ever since then, I've just been editing it. I sent it to beta readers to read. And it's ultimately a book that I never expected to finish, say like pre-COVID. Like those last few months before COVID started. It's a book I never thought I would finish. And then COVID hit. And then all of a sudden, I have a lot of free time. So I just picked it up, got passionate about it again, and finished the story, and am now hopefully going to be hopefully going to be publishing it this summer. Hopefully, if everything goes as planned. We'll see. The world is a very crazy place right now, and I don't know. And it also raises an interesting point of like, when do you stop working on a project? Because if you're another author who's watching this video, I'm sure you've had, or another writer who is watching this video, I'm sure you've had struggles with like getting frustrated with a project and debating whether to give it up or not. And for this one specific project I've been working on, it ultimately worked out. Keep coming back to it, but there was a ton of projects I worked on that did not work out, and I'm wondering if I went back to them, would they have ultimately been better? So like, I ultimately throw it up to random writing advice. If something keeps bringing you back to the project, maybe there's a reason for it, and maybe if you abandon the project, you never go back to it, there's also a reason for that as well. So just follow like whatever your instinctual drive is. If you keep going back to it, then it's great. And if you keep going back to it, then maybe there's something there. Maybe there is a story that you want to tell. And my book, which I'll get into a little bit now, is in the sci-fi fantasy genre. It's not YA though. It also has a lot of influence from Slang, Must, and Fire, from my love of ancient Rome, and just from like a myriad of different things that I've consumed during like the multiple years that it's taken me to write it, and through my travel experiences as well. Like a lot of my architecture and settings that I write in the book a lot of them are from like my travel experiences too. And I definitely noticed during COVID the importance of writing every single day, because it's something that I never did when, pre-COVID basically. I would go through stages where I was writing pretty often, usually when I was, pretty miserable with my social life at the time, but I would go through stages when I wasn't writing often, and then there'd be stages where I wasn't writing for months on end. And then COVID hit, and I was writing every day or editing every day. It's totally changed my evolution as a writer. And I know like it's kind of like a joke in the r/writing jerk community. It's like, oh, just write, like like, oh, why never think of that? But for me, just writing has helped tremendously, much more than any horrible authortube writing advice video. That's another point. That's another story. And I would encourage you that like if you're struggling with writing, like literally just do it every day. Do something every day, as long as it's a considerable amount of time, whatever, and also you're doing it daily, you're going to see exponential improvement. But also during COVID is when I really got into reading classical literature and just reading a larger variety of literature in general. And that's had a huge impact on my writing too. Mainly in like helping me realize how horrible a writer I am. Like I read To the Lighthouse recently, and I'm like, this book, I'll never be able to write anything that's like a tenth as good as this book. But it's also motivating in a way because it helps you put your writing in perspective of like, put it in the perspective of James Joyce, put it in the perspective of Virginia Woolf. And although it might crumble in comparison, it'll also help you see where your faults are as a writer, as it did for me personally. And that's kind of like the concoction for me with how I've gotten to this point where I've successfully finished a book and feel comfortable with self-publishing it, is through writing every day and through reading a large variety of works, a lot of which can be considered challenging or difficult, at least, I mean, compared to, I don't know, James Patterson or something, or Tom Clancy. I haven't read any Patterson or Clancy though, so it's, not a very good argument, but that's ultimately what has helped me and what's helped me drive my passion for writing and for literature. And it hasn't been, smooth sailing the whole time. There are times where I'll be up at like midnight rereading a chapter. I'm like, this is the worst thing I've ever read in my life. But then you keep going back to it. So I think that the fact that I keep going back to it, regardless of what happens, regardless of the difficult obstacles I come across, perhaps there is like a drive there or a passion there that will exceed any sort of hard times that I've gone through thus far. Not that, there are going to be a ton of more hard times to go as I start to publish, but as of right now with the writing process itself and getting over that confidence problem where you're reading your own stuff and it's not really the way you want it to turn out, just keep going with it and eventually it'll get better. At least that's from my experience. And so back to my book again. If you made it to this part of the video, congratulations. Your reward is me plugging my newsletter, which I'll put in the link below if you're interested. This newsletter will primarily be for updating my audience, I guess, of like what I've been reading recently that I don't do videos on, and also like updates on the publishing process of my book and marketing stuff. So just be aware of that. If you're interested in just what I'm reading too, like you can subscribe to it because I will be putting content on it that's not related to my book specifically, but I will also tell you in advance that I will be using it to market my book too. So yeah, just be warned for that. There will be emails for that too if I garner enough followers on my newsletter, that is. And yeah, so it'll be interesting to look at this video in retrospect a few months later, like after my book is out. And I just thought this was a fun idea to do. While I'm reading two giant books, I'm reading The Recognitions right now and the Lord of the Rings series, so no book content recently because I've just been stuck reading these books and I have nothing really to talk about with those yet. But no, expect a video on The Recognitions, I would say. I'm pretty confident I'm going to do a video on that. And expect a video on Ernest Hemingway coming up pretty soon as well. And also, I was on Drunzo's channel. We did a book haul together, so I hope you will check that out as well. And check out Colors Wonderland, as always. I don't know if he's made a video recently, but he's had some good videos, too. And yeah, thank you if you made it this far. Again, let me know like what your experience with writing is, because I'm legitimately fascinated. And hopefully I will see you in the next video. Thank you, and goodbye.